On tutorial 6, we're going to start in on the camera player setup. So if you go to your scenes and you double click on the tutorial 6 one, it will open up to a scene like this. What we're going to do is basically just look at how to set up the camera system itself. If you go over to your hierarchy tab and you click on the actor rollout, inside of the actor we're going to have a new game object that's going to just simply be a holder. It's going to hold our main camera and our player. Now, at this point, the player itself has quite a few collision boxes and things that we're looking and checking for. So if you notice, remember we've placed in a lot of these. And then for the camera, we've started to place in some of the elements for the camera. Now, the camera itself could be a single camera, and that's all it has to be. But what we're doing is try and go for a few more so we can actually add different ones for different depth layers. So if you notice the first camera right here, this is going to be our main camera. If you look at the camera preview window, do you see the one right here? You'll notice that the only thing showing is actually just the ground layer that the player walks on, and then the player itself. There's no background sky layer from the skybox. There's nothing else actually in the scene for it. Each one on the layers, we'll go over here and look in the inspector real quick. Let me move this over. For the camera properties, you'll notice that there is a clear flags. If you haven't used cameras before, or you've only used them for a little bit, be sure that you want to take some time and read up on it. But the main thing is that for us, what we're doing is actually setting the depth plane. You can set it to, for instance, if I did skybox, it's actually going to show the sky in the background. Now, I don't want this for this particular one, but you can actually set each individual one for different ones. You can also just choose a solid color so that it doesn't show the sky box, but it just shows a color behind them. And then we have one which is the one we have, which is depth only. The depth only is actually pulling from the depth on the option down here. This actually allows you to draw a different layer of a camera on top of another camera. So we have this one set to 1, which is almost, you can go negative with it, but this is also one of the less ones on the values for it. Alright, and the other option we have inside of here is the projection type. For the one where the character is actually walking on, in terms like the camera showing the character, showing the actual geometry for the objects, those we want to make sure the projection method is set for orthographic. Okay. Now this means that we're just going to get it's going to look 2D. There's not going to be any perspective or depth to the scene on that one. Okay. Now our other options inside of here, you'll notice that we have the camera, the perspective back, and we've got clouds, front and middle. These are more of just, it could be named or labeled however you want, but these are names that I came up with while thinking about where I want my camera to render and what part. We'll eventually want a camera as well that just renders the HUD, so that the HUD pieces are by themselves as well. For this one though, you'll notice that for the camera, the perspective back, we have the clear flags is set to skybox. So the only thing this camera actually renders is the actual background, the skybox area right here. When we get to the clouds layer, you'll notice that there's no options inside of here available. This one as well, front and middle, there's not going to actually be anything seen because there's nothing on those layers at the moment. When it comes to actually seeing or not seeing some of these pieces, what you want to do is actually set, this is where culling masks come in, is that the culling mask itself, if you click on the drop down for culling mask actually has everything available inside of the layer option. So for instance, on the layer, if there's a layer called, if one of our objects from our prefabs has a layer that is one of these, and it happens to be checked the same as the one that's on this one, then it's going to actually see it. Okay, so for these, if I happen to go over here, and let's go to our prefabs. Let's see, we'll zoom out here a little bit. On the prefabs, if we start off with, let's say for instance, the prefab item mountain. If I drag the item mountain over here, this one, notice that when I drop it into the scene, now again this is the pro version, so you'll notice that there's going to be a blur. All the perspective cameras, they're going to have, let's see which one it is. There we go. The perspective on the clouds one, that one, and the middle ground perspective both have blurs assigned for the post effect there. Alright, so with the mountain, notice though that the mountain currently is in the foreground. It's clearly in front of everything else, but because of the way the camera is set up to render, no matter what you do on this part, if the mountain itself has the layer set to perspective back, so for instance, perspective back is going to be this one. The only one showing on it is going to be the perspective back. So you can tell that the camera itself right here is actually doing the preview for it. Alright, so if it's actually set to this, and we can check on our perspective back on the depth is set to -1, which actually means it's forcing it to be behind anything else. If I was to set this to, say, 2, when I render it out, notice that this is actually in front of. This whole thing draws it because this is also set to skybox. If I did depth only, then we're going to actually have both layers rendering, but this is still in front because the depth is greater than 1, which is currently the depth for this one. Alright, so if I set this to -1, then -1 will actually force it back into the background again. However, it's also doing just the depth only. If we wanted to make sure that it was not just depth only, but it was also including the skybox, we could do the skybox this way, and now we've got a nice cutout for each one of those. So if we want to try another one out here, let's go ahead and go back to our prefabs over here. And on the prefab, there's a item cloud 1, and we drag a cloud 1 and a cloud 2 into the scene. Alright, now the two clouds, taking these in the scene, we could just move these down so we can see them in the viewport here. Alright, the clouds themselves, in order to get rendered inside the scene, we need to do a couple extra things with them. So for instance, like right now, they are pushed way too far, they're actually too far forward from even the camera's view. So we'll take these and move them back. And you'll notice that as we move them, the size actually changes. And remember, the reason for this is that, like these currently, these are actually on the camera perspective clouds. So meaning that the layer is set for clouds. The culling mask is actually just checking for objects with a layer called perspective clouds. So each of these two items, the cloud 1 and cloud 2, have a layer for perspective clouds. Alright, now the rendering on that one for the depth, on the depth side of this one, let's see where it's at. Depth is on a -0.5. So again, if you're looking for smaller values, this will be in front of the mountains when it's rendering out. But you could also even set it to a different one. Now, what we have here though is two objects that have a specific type to it. So again, if I have my camera clouds selected, the only thing it's going to show are just the two clouds. It's on depth only, so it's just a cutout of these two objects right there. Alright. Just to see it a little bit clearer here, we could increase this one. There we go. So we have this one just right in front of the other one. And then we could also do, just to make things work a little bit smoother, when you're working on this, you could have a cloud set up so it does that, but at the same time, moving your object forward and backward, you can double check with your game view where you actually want it inside the scene. So for instance, if I wanted something a little bit more like this, I could be a little more specific with where it goes. It also makes it a little bit easier to actually work with inside of this view. That way you actually have, for instance, like this, I would want to put actually behind here. That way I'm not trying to deal with seeing, trying to find hidden layers and things. Alright, so at the same time, one additional thought with this is that up on the right hand side in Unity you have layer options. This layer option is actually more of a filter. I could go up here and just actually choose only a single layer to show. So for instance, if we wanted just to have clouds turned off, we could turn the clouds off in this layer. If you wanted to have the orthographic view turned off, we could actually have it turned off and it's not going to show those. So you can be very specific while you're working with what you're actually seeing, what you're actually working on, if you wind up doing things like putting objects and items in the foreground, but it might not make the best of level design practices and techniques. Alright, so we have those. And main thing again, just to remember, is that these are just going to help us control, in terms of cameras, these are just simply allowing us to place different items on different layers. And then depending on the depth for these items, it'll just render out differently as the player walks by. So for instance, if I'm playing the game on this one, I'll actually have to set the camera to follow the player. Here, we'll do that real fast. So if we were to take camera, and don't worry about this doing this part, you can just watch on this one. I'm just going to go ahead and lose the prefab here and have it where it follows the player. So when it goes across right here, you notice that all the layers are actually, as parallaxing, is that all layers are just moving at a different speed as you go across with it. Right, just allowing it to feel more like a layered sense as it goes back through it. Alright. Okay. So that's going to be our basic camera setup. Again, when you're working on your own, you may find that you want one camera for the orthographic, and maybe you just want one camera for all the parts and pieces. When I was working on this one, I think one thing that came to mind was that I really wanted to start separating different pieces out. That way, I wasn't too concerned about making a mistake by having something too far in the front or too far in the back. But through the camera's perspective, just allows me to make sure I'm having the depth set where I want it to be set on. The last one, actually, just so you can see this one as well. If we were to do, let's see, say the prefab tree. If I was to place a tree inside the scene, and we'll actually move the tree up and make it like a large sequoia tree or something. If you wanted to have a foreground element, you could actually do the foreground and change the layer instead of ortho. Actually set it to perspective front, and perspective front is going to make sure that the object is in front of everything else. We could even scale it down just a little bit here. Make it a skinny tree. Alright. So you can have it this way. That way when it plays, the player actually walks in front of the tree. And this would be regardless of where it is in the scene. The player, whenever they go to the object, the player would go behind the object. And this object as well, if it's set to the camera, would be parallaxing at a different speed as well. Alright. So that's basically the idea behind the camera setup. It gives you a start point at which we're going to be using. The main camera, remember, the two main cameras that you want to have in most any scene that you're working on for a 2D game are going to be an orthographic camera for the main player and the scene that the level that the player is walking on. And then you want to have a perspective camera, at bare minimum at least one perspective camera that's rendering out the background so that you can have parallaxing with different layers through that part of it. Alright, and then the other part, notice then we've already kind of set this, is that the orthographic size. Again, on the camera, if I wanted to actually adjust this, I could change the orthographic size. Watch the box right here. Is that while I actually drag this left and right, it changes the size, which is basically bringing in, zooming or zooming out the size that's shown inside the game. Alright, so then if we were to play it, we would actually have a character much closer to the screen as you're playing. And this is actually something that in-game you could dynamically move up and down and change the actual size to the zoom distance too. Alright. So again, that will finish off our setup for the camera. If you want to try it out on your own, then try just to bring in a camera. One of the tricks that I did, you could just make sure everything is set to, like if you're making from scratch, you're making a camera, you can either we'll do this one just so you can see the process for it here. If I was to drop in a camera in the scene, I would want to make sure, for instance, the camera itself is that the rotations were all set to 0. You could do a real easy one where you set everything to 0 here. And if you set it all to 0, then it's going to allow you just to make it easier so that you know all the other cameras are being created at the same spot. You could also do, if you have your camera like off a strange angle or something, and you're trying to make all your other cameras equal to, say, this angle, just make a copy of this camera. So for instance, if this was your orthographic one, so maybe I was going to do just ortho on it, and it would do nothing, and then set just an ortho. So say for instance, like right now, see it's rendering right here. Actually, see, it's actually rendering that layer right there. If I was going to have that camera rendering, but then all of a sudden I didn't want perspective, we just want orthographic, this camera was going to be 1, but if you wanted the other to be perspective, just push Control D. Just make a copy of that of this camera. So Control D on here makes a copy in the exact same spot. So then I can actually just go to projection and do perspective, and then I'll be able to render out both the orthographic and perspective in the same area. And then also just make the perspective a child of the main camera here. And then you could just relabel it. This could be camera orthographic, and this could be camera perspective. Alright, and that would give you the setup that you would need to actually start in on the first set of camera. Alright, so again, this will be the one that we use for this game. When you're bringing in art assets or you're bringing anything new into this one, don't forget that if your new art asset that you drop in doesn't have, like for instance, if I had a prefab here and it didn't have a layer type assigned, say it was just default. Well, if I had it set to default, that means that when let me zoom in here, if I was to drag this default into the scene and drop it in, notice it doesn't show up down here. So don't forget about that, is that in order to see things inside of our current setup with these cameras, you have to actually define the layer as one of the camera types. Otherwise it's being called out, so it's not being actually displayed. If I do orthographic, it magically appears right there. Alright, so just remember that when you start dropping in assets, or if you're bringing in new assets, you want to make sure that you assign it to a layer. We'll change that one back. Alright, so that'll finish off our camera setup. We're going to move into working on the first camera type.